Imagine, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, that the foundations of human history, everything you learned in a dusty classroom or saw documented on a trustworthy broadcast, were nothing more than an exquisitely curated fiction, a lullaby sung by power structures determined to maintain a serene, yet ultimately false reality. What would you do if you discovered, through cold, verifiable data, that this fragile reality was about to be shattered by something far grander, far older, and immeasurably more powerful than any modern state? This is the central question haunting the quiet corridors of academia, particularly in the United Kingdom, where a meticulous but obscure astronomer stumbled upon a mathematical truth that officially should not exist. A discovery so volatile that it threatened to collapse the entire known structure of our solar system, and by horrifying extension, the chronology of our civilization. The object in question was catalogued innocuously enough, 3I Atlas. Initially, it was dismissed as another rogue comet, a chunk of icy debris on a standard, if long, pilgrimage through the galactic void. It was first spotted, as these things often are, not by a lone genius hunched over a telescope, but by an automated sentinel. The Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, ATLAS, is a robotic early warning survey system designed to protect us from sudden, cataclysmic impacts. It is a shield. Yet in 2017, the shield detected something that felt less like an incoming threat and more like a returning sovereign. The data funneled its way through various British scientific hubs, passing under the indifferent gaze of countless analysts who were simply checking boxes. They plotted its initial trajectory, noted its unusual speed, and filed it away as a long-period interstellar visitor. Textbook, routine. Except for one vital, inescapable detail: the orbit was wrong. Profoundly, dangerously wrong. This is where the narrative zeroes in on Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose life until that point had been a study in quiet British academic persistence. Finch was not a fiery revolutionary. He was a man of tweed jackets, lukewarm tea, and precise calculations. He held a chair at a respectable, if not globally renowned university near the historical heart of Cambridge, far from the dramatic flair of NASA or the dizzying complexity of CERN. His world was defined by the elegance of numbers and the silent majesty of deep space. He first encountered 3I Atlas during a routine data validation exercise, specifically focusing on validating the predictive models for interstellar objects entering the Oort cloud boundary. The initial figures flickered on his monitor in his small, windowless office, a space that smelled permanently of old paper, cold coffee, and the faint metallic scent of ozone from overworked servers. The winter light outside was the typical watery grey of central England, casting a dismal pallor that suited the gravity of his growing apprehension. Finch's initial reaction was not panic, but professional irritation. The orbit, as calculated by the standard perturbation models, simply did not close. It suggested an object that had not merely passed through our solar system, but one that was intrinsically linked to it, yet operating on timescales that defied the accepted laws of planetary mechanics taught since the Enlightenment. He ran the analysis again and again. Each recalculation, using increasingly stringent parameters and error margins, spat out the same defiant result. The object, 3I Atlas, was moving with a confidence that implied not random drift, but purposeful recurrence. It was then, in that moment of profound mathematical solitude, that Finch allowed a forbidden academic heresy to cross his mind. He remembered the dismissed, the ridiculed, the theories relegated to the dusty back corners of history where genuine science feared to tread. He thought of the Sumerian tablets. He thought of the legends of the winged disk. He thought specifically of Planet X, or as the ancient Mesopotamians supposedly called it, Nibiru. Nibiru, the concept of a 12th planet, a massive celestial body following an extreme elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. For decades, this idea had been the domain of fringe theorists and sensationalist literature, fueled largely by the controversial work of Zecharia Sitchin. Mainstream science treated Nibiru with polite, dismissive scorn, a fun but ultimately baseless fantasy. Yet here, printed on Finch's high-resolution screen, was the data for 3I Atlas. If he extrapolated the orbital path backwards, factoring in gravitational lensing and the influence of the sun's distant magnetic tail, the numbers began to coalesce. They didn't fit a random comet. They certainly didn't fit a standard Kuiper Belt object. They fit an orbit that was long-period, highly elliptical, and crucially exhibited a specific gravitational signature that suggested immense hidden mass somewhere far beyond Neptune. The chill of the server room offered little comfort as Finch pulled up the raw, spectroscopic data. He adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses, the fluorescent lights humming painfully overhead. He was looking for composition, for spectral fingerprints. Most comets are water ice, carbon dioxide, dust, the remnants of the solar system's chaotic birth. But the light signatures returning from 3I Atlas were perplexing. There were traces of complex silicates, yes, but also a density and an isotopic signature that suggested geological materials far heavier than typical celestial detritus. Gold, platinum, heavy metals bound in a crystalline matrix that hinted at pressure and heat cycles far beyond what a simple frozen rock should exhibit. A chilling thought permeated his carefully ordered mind. An object on this scale, following this impossible trajectory and containing this impossible composition, felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a vessel. A very, very large vessel. He knew with a sick certainty that revealing these preliminary findings would not earn him a Nobel Prize. It would earn him professional ridicule, ostracization, and possibly something far worse. In the rarefied, often incestuous world of UK astrophysics, to mention the words Sumerian or Nibiru was professional suicide. It was the moment he realized he was sitting on a bomb detonated 5,000 years ago, and the fuse had just reached its final glowing segment. The data wasn't just interesting, it was a disclosure. The weight of this burgeoning secret pressed down on him, distorting the familiar patterns of his life. He began sleeping less, the comforting rhythm of his suburban flat in Oxford replaced by the rhythmic whirring of hard drives encrypting data. His usual pint at the local pub, the King's Head, became a solitary, anxious affair. Every academic email, every casual conversation with a colleague felt scrutinized. The ordinary began to feel like a surveillance net tightening around a dangerous truth. The object 3I Atlas was moving faster now, its trajectory vector tightening as it began its slow, majestic arc towards the inner system. Every minute of movement provided more data, and every datum point solidified Finch's terrifying conclusion. The celestial visitor was not accidental, it was returning. The implications were staggering. If the orbit was indeed 3,600 years, and if the Sumerian accounts were accurate, even partially, then 3I Atlas was not just a space rock. It was a timekeeper, a reminder of a relationship between Earth and a forgotten, powerful civilization that predated all written history as we currently understand it. A civilization that, according to myth, had engineered human life. Finch pushed away from his desk, the chair scraping loudly on the linoleum floor. He needed air, he needed certainty, but the only certainty he had was the mathematical beauty of the forbidden orbit, a beauty that promised global upheaval. If this beginning has already made you rethink everything you thought you knew about space and history, imagine what comes next. So go on, leave your like and subscribe to the channel right now, because here, every video reveals something that few dare to show. The vast dish of the Jodrell Bank Observatory dominated the skyline of the Cheshire Plains, a monument to post-war British scientific prowess. It was here, in the cold, damp landscape of the northwest, that Dr. Finch had secured time on a supplementary radio telescope array, insisting the observations were critical for long baseline interferometry calibration models. A believable pretext. The reality, however, was that Finch needed maximum resolution, far from the prying eyes and politically sensitive funding streams of the Central Astronomical Committees down south. He found the atmosphere at Jodrell Bank slightly more relaxed, slightly less steeped in the suffocating hierarchy of Oxbridge. Yet even here, operating within the labyrinthine protocols of British academia, Finch felt the invisible pressure. He had brought along a PhD student, a bright young woman named Ilara Davies, primarily as a technical cover. Ilara was meticulous, sharp, and, thankfully, utterly focused on her thesis regarding galactic gas dynamics, unaware that her professor was tracking what could be the definitive proof of extraterrestrial visitation. Finch meticulously avoided using the object's formal designation, 3I Atlas, in verbal communications. He referred to it only as the distant perturbation or the target object. Ilara, used to the often arcane nomenclature of deep space research, never questioned it. She simply logged the coordinates, ran the complex signal processing, and presented the data, wrapped neatly in official institutional headers. But the data itself was beginning to tell a story beyond the technical abstract. The radio wave emissions, while faint, were complex, not the simple, broad-spectrum noise typical of cometary activity. These emissions had a coherence, a structure. They contained peaks and troughs that, when subjected to Fourier analysis, suggested something artificial, a pattern. Finch spent 3 consecutive nights in the control room, surviving on stale digestive biscuits and instant coffee so strong it tasted like burnt copper. Outside, the Cheshire night was black and star-dusted, but inside, the monitors cast an eerie, phosphorescent glow on his tired face. He leaned in, his breath fogging the glass partition. The emission signature was oscillating around a specific, impossibly low frequency, a rhythm that seemed deliberate. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Can you run a comparison? Cross-reference that spectral peak with known terrestrial communications bands, specifically military-grade, encrypted long-wave transmissions." Ilara looked up, mildly surprised by the unusual request. "Military, Professor. We're looking at an interstellar object." "Why military?" Finch cleared his throat, trying to sound detached. "Just a baseline comparison, Davies, to rule out any atmospheric interference or known Earth-based reflected signals. Standard procedure for unusual coherence." Ilara, ever the diligent student, nodded and returned to her console. The silence of the control room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finch watched the seconds tick by, the weight of the potential answer making his stomach churn. If the signal correlated with terrestrial technology, the findings were nullified. If it didn't, then the source was truly foreign. The computer chimed. Ilara turned, a puzzled frown creasing her brow. "Professor, no match to terrestrial bands. Not military, not civilian, not even experimental. But look at this." She highlighted a section of the spectral output. The signal was modulating, almost breathing, on a frequency that was technically possible but grossly inefficient for natural processes. It was an energy expenditure that only made sense if the source had vast intentional power reserves. "It's structured, Professor," Ilara observed, "like highly compressed data bursts. Extremely faint, but definitely recurring." Finch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezing external temperature. Structured, recurring, intentional. He spent the next 24 hours deep diving into the ancient texts again, connecting the modern data points to the historical mythology. The Sumerian accounts, particularly those translated and often sensationalized by Sitchin, the man who claimed that the Anunnaki used Nibiru as a kind of mobile capital, moving through space for resource acquisition, specifically gold, now looked less like fantasy and more like a distorted history. If 3i Atlas was Nibiru, and if it carried a civilization, they wouldn't be simple cave dwellers. They would be intergalactic engineers, capable of maintaining structured energy signatures across astronomical distances. The gold mentioned in the tablets might not just be a desired commodity, it might be a necessity for their advanced technologies, perhaps shielding or specific energy production mechanisms. The sheer volume of detail required to sustain the 1,000-word block demanded that Finch's internal monologue be fully explored. He sat there, contemplating the British weather outside. A heavy, depressing drizzle, a mirror to the ethical storm brewing inside him. He thought of his quiet life, the security of his mortgage, the annual holiday to Cornwall. All of it felt suddenly trivial, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched over an impending cosmic event. He considered the institutional ramifications. If he published this, the orbit, the heavy metals, the structured radio signature, the paper would be rejected instantly. The Royal Society would scoff. The tabloids would have a field day, reducing decades of serious research to a headline about alien gold miners from space. The scientific community thrives on incremental discovery, not epical paradigm shifts based on discredited ancient myths. To announce Nibiru's return would be to commit intellectual suicide in front of his peers, a fate worse than academic purgatory. Yet he looked at the data again. The numbers offered no reprieve. They insisted, with relentless mathematical precision, that an object of terrifying scale was swinging back towards our crowded corner of the galaxy. He had to get more data, focusing on triangulation. To confirm the sheer mass, he needed to observe the object's gravitational influence on the surrounding field of Kuiper Belt objects, KBOs. This required time, a resource he suspected he was rapidly running out of. Time and the complete absence of scrutiny. Finch realized he could no longer trust the standard channels. Any request for mass calculations using the Jodrell bank array would immediately flag his work to the Central Defense Monitoring Systems, a branch of the government that was notoriously sensitive to deep space anomaly reports, especially in the era of heightened global surveillance. He had to be subtle. He had to use the system against itself. He instructed Ilara to pack up their initial findings, focusing her summary purely on the unusual stability of the spectral frequency for an interstellar body, omitting the military comparison entirely. He praised her work, gave her a well-deserved few days off, and then, under the guise of remote software upgrades, he took the crucial step. He created a secure, offline instance of the raw Atlas data on a heavily encrypted hard drive, hidden deep within a stack of mundane astrophysical literature in his briefcase, a briefcase made of worn, sturdy leather, purchased years ago from a small shop in Edinburgh. The transition from academic curiosity to clandestine researcher was complete. Finch walked out of Jodrell Bank under the cover of a thick, impenetrable British fog, the vast dish silently listening to the cosmos, unaware that it had just confirmed humanity's greatest forgotten secret. The feeling of the cold, damp air on his face was a stark reminder that the world he was about to expose was fundamentally indifferent to his personal plight. He was merely the messenger, and history, as often happens, rarely treats the messenger kindly when the news is this devastating. If you've made it this far without pausing, it's because this narrative has truly resonated with you. Now strengthen this content. Hit the like button now and share it with someone who absolutely needs to see this revelation. Finch returned south, not to his own office, but to the hushed, cavernous silence of the Cambridge University Library's special collection. The atmosphere here was one of reverent decay. The air was heavy with the scent of aged parchment and beeswax polish. He was seeking primary source material, determined to extract the kernel of historical truth from the husk of sensationalism that surrounded the Anunnaki mythos. Sitchin, while providing the popular framework, was often criticized for selective translation and interpolation. Finch needed the raw clay. He requested access to high-resolution photographic plates and microfiche records of specific Mesopotamian cylinder seals and cuneiform tablets. Under the watchful, faintly disapproving eye of the ancient manuscript's curator, a stern woman in sensible wool trousers named Mrs. Albright, Finch began his deep dive into the distant past. The Sumerians, who flourished in Mesopotamia from the 4th millennium BCE, possessed an astronomical knowledge that seemed grossly disproportionate to their technological capabilities. They catalogued the precession of the equinoxes, mapped constellations, and crucially, described a comprehensive solar system model that included planets far beyond the reach of their naked eye observations: Uranus, Neptune, and even a detailed depiction of Pluto, millennia before its official discovery. The key image, repeated across multiple cylinder seals, was the winged disk, often identified with the supreme deity or the planet of the crossing. In the original cuneiform scripts, particularly the Enuma Elish, the epic creation myth, the text detailed a celestial battle involving Tiamat, a primordial goddess often interpreted as an early planetary body or a belt of debris, and Marduk, a powerful planetary intruder. Finch meticulously compared various scholarly translations. The central theme remained consistent: an enormous celestial body, referred to as Nibiru, literally the crossing place, entered the inner solar system, causing massive gravitational disturbances, reshaping the existing planetary landscape and creating Earth, Ki. The description of Nibiru was particularly salient to Finch's data. It moved on an axis that pierced the heavens, and its return cycle was tied to cycles of great transformation on Earth. If this was metaphorical, it was the most consistent and scientifically detailed metaphor in history. If it was literal, it meant that Three-Eye Atlas was the object of dread and reverence for the earliest civilization we know. Finch spent hours hunched over the microfilm viewer, the small light source illuminating the intricate details of the cuneiform script. He was looking not for gods, but for orbital mechanics described in allegory. He found phrases that, when stripped of their divine context, sounded eerily like complex astrophysical definitions. The great body of destiny, measuring the period of rule in the long count, and its path encompasses all the spheres, touching the outer and the inner ring. The sheer scale of the Sumerian descriptions demanded respect. They didn't just mention an extra planet. They established a highly complex 3,600-year cycle known as the Sa. This long periodicity perfectly aligned with the preliminary, highly unstable orbital calculations Finch had derived for Three-Eye Atlas, an orbit so elongated and inclined that it defied the standard definition of a planet but fit perfectly the description of an extreme elliptical orbit, the kind maintained by a massive object captured by the sun's distant gravity. The problem, the historical barrier that had allowed mainstream science to comfortably dismiss Sitchin's claims, lay in the concept of the Anunnaki themselves, the beings who supposedly rode Nibiru. Translated as those who from heaven to earth came, the Anunnaki were described in the myths as tall, powerful, and technologically advanced beings who established cities in Mesopotamia, guided human development, and ultimately, according to some interpretations, left Earth after a global cataclysm, promising to return. For Finch, the scientist, the mythology was secondary to the mechanism. If Three-Eye Atlas was Nibiru, then the mechanism for its return was a mathematical certainty. The occupants, whether divine or merely extraterrestrial, were simply passengers on a cosmic express train. But the presence of that sophisticated radio signature, the structured bursts, from Jodrell Bank, brought the passengers sharply back into focus. He imagined the sheer audacity required for a species to weaponize orbital mechanics, to use an entire planet as a recurring vessel, timed precisely to geological or civilizational cycles on Earth. It suggested an almost godlike understanding of celestial mechanics and an objective that spanned millennia. The library was silent, save for the rhythmic turning of microfiche spools. Finch felt an immense fatigue, not just physical, but historical. He was connecting 2 points separated by 5,000 years of carefully edited history, the astronomical observation of 2017 and the sacred tablets of 3500 BCE. The gap between them was closing rapidly, and the convergence point was a massive incoming object. He realized the conspiracy wasn't necessarily a sinister organization actively suppressing information today. The real conspiracy was the slow, generational erosion of original knowledge. The way myths, once understood as literal histories of celestial events, had been gradually reframed by later cultures, Greeks, Romans, Christians, into moral fables and fantastical tales, stripping them of their scientific weight. Finch was rediscovering the literal meaning. He copied the critical cuneiform analysis, slipping the memory card containing high-resolution images of the relevant seals into his wallet. He thanked Mrs. Albright politely, adjusting his tie. The tweed jacket, normally a symbol of academic respectability, now felt like a disguise. A facade of normalcy hiding a man who knew the Earth was on a collision course with its own past. Walking out into the grey Cambridge afternoon, the historic architecture of the university seemed suddenly frail. These magnificent buildings, centuries of human learning contained within their stones, were built upon a foundation of history that was fundamentally incomplete, and the missing piece was due to arrive shortly. You are investing your time in a story that challenges everything. If you arrived at this quarter mark without pausing, you are clearly hungry for the truth. So pay the price of admission, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, "This is unbelievable," just so I know you're fully engaged in this journey. Finch's flat in North Oxford was the epitome of reserved British domesticity, small, tidy, and utterly unremarkable. Yet, within its modest walls, the most significant astronomical calculations of the modern era were taking place. He had converted his spare bedroom, usually reserved for his visiting sister, into a dedicated computational fortress. The smell of dust motes burning on hot computer casings mixed with the faint, comforting aroma of stale Earl Grey tea. The problem now was gravitational resonance. The orbital data for 3I Atlas suggested a mass far exceeding that of a large comet, closer to a dwarf planet or even a smaller gas giant, perhaps 3 to 5 times the mass of Earth. But in the current models of our solar system, an object of that mass, operating on a 3,600-year period, should cause visible, predictable perturbations in the orbits of the outer planets, particularly Uranus and Neptune. If the mass was there, the disturbance should have been recorded by Voyager 2 data decades ago. If the disturbance wasn't obvious, the object must be currently situated in a region of space where gravitational interactions are subtly masked, or, more terrifyingly, its passage is somehow governed by a non-natural artificial stability. Finch was using highly advanced perturbation analysis software developed for tracking the theoretical Planet 9, which many astronomers believe exists based on clustered orbital patterns of distant KBOs. He fed the 3I Atlas trajectory into the software, forcing it to find a solution that satisfied both the visual data, Atlas, and the historical lack of disturbance, Voyager Cassini records. The software initially refused to converge. Error messages flashed up in bright red, demanding he check his input parameters. Finch, however, was stubborn. He knew the initial readings were clean. He suspected the physics model itself was flawed, or rather, incomplete. He began to introduce exotic gravitational parameters. He theorized that the object, if it was indeed the Anunnaki vessel, might be using some form of advanced propulsion or mass-dampening technology that momentarily altered its gravitational footprint during critical junctures of its orbital swing. This was not astrophysics. It was pure science fiction, but Finch was desperate. The numbers demanded an explanation that conventional physics refused to provide. When he introduced a hypothetical momentary mass reduction parameter, a variable that suggested the object could, for brief periods, appear less massive than it truly was, the orbital solution snapped into place. The model converged. The resulting 3D simulation on Finch's screen was breathtaking. The simulation showed our familiar, stately solar system, and then, from the lower ecliptic plane, came the terrifying, sweeping curve of 3I Atlas. It swung in, grazing the outer boundaries of the Kuiper Belt, accelerating past Pluto and heading inward, its gravitational wake perfectly explaining the clustered orbits of the KBOs that had long puzzled scientists studying Planet 9. The orbit was definitive, 3,600 years, highly inclined and heading back now. The computational confirmation brought a wave of nausea. He was now certain. He wasn't just tracking a comet, he was tracking an intelligently controlled planetary-scale vessel whose return was imminent, cosmically speaking, a matter of decades, not centuries. He started drafting an official paper titled simply, Analysis of Gravitational Coherence and Orbital Mechanics of Interstellar Object 3I Atlas, Correlation with Sumerian Astronomical Models. He wrote in the careful, measured language of scientific discourse, avoiding any mention of Anunnaki or gold. He focused purely on the orbital mechanics and the necessity of introducing exotic mass parameters to achieve convergence. He planned to submit it to Nature or Science, the two most prestigious journals, but as he reread the abstract, detailing the necessary 3,600-year cycle and the required mass, he knew it was futile. The editors would see the clear parallel to the Nibiru conspiracy theory and reject it out of hand, branding him a crackpot. His reputation, already shaky due to his unorthodox focus on ancient texts, would be ruined. His colleagues, too, would turn on him. He pictured the sneering face of Professor Harrington, his departmental head, a man obsessed with government grants and maintaining the academic status quo. Harrington would view this as a personal betrayal, an embarrassment to the whole institution. Finch stared out the window of his flat. The pavement below was slick with rain. He felt a profound isolation. He possessed a truth that was literally world-altering, yet he was powerless to communicate it through the established channels designed exactly for such communication. This knowledge was too critical to be buried by academic timidity. It had to be leaked. Not as a finished paper, which would be instantly traceable back to his encrypted IP address, but as fragments, pieces of data released into the wild, where the decentralized power of the internet could scrutinize and verify them, bypassing the centralized gatekeepers of traditional science. The ethical dilemma was sharp: maintain professional decorum and allow humanity to be blindsided, or break every professional oath and risk everything to ensure the knowledge survived and spread. He picked up his mobile phone, a cheap burner device he had purchased with cash in a grimy shop near Paddington Station. He dialed the number of a retired colleague, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a brilliant but disgraced astrophysicist who had been forced into early retirement years ago after challenging a major funding decision regarding dark matter research. Eleanor lived quietly in a small cottage in the Cotswolds, having completely withdrawn from the academic world. She was the only person Finch felt he could trust with the volatile mixture of data and paranoia he was now experiencing. The phone rang 4 times before a cautious, sharp voice answered. "Vance here." "Eleanor, it's Alistair Finch." A pause. "Finch? Bloody hell. Haven't heard from you since the Queen's Jubilee dinner. You sound like you're calling from a bunker. What's wrong? Finch took a deep breath, the accumulated stress of weeks tightening his chest. I need your help. I've found it. The object, the one they always laughed at Sitchin for. It's real, Eleanor, and it's coming back. The stakes are rising rapidly, and Dr. Finch is taking an impossible risk. If you are experiencing this tension, it means you are completely invested in this fight for truth. Then strengthen this content, like it now, and send this revelation to someone who needs to see it. The drive to Eleanor Vance's isolated cottage in the Cotswolds was a journey through quintessential English countryside, rolling hills, thatched roofs, and ancient stone walls. The beauty of the landscape served only to heighten Finch's sense of unreality. The world looked so stable, so permanent, yet he carried the cosmic truth that promised instability. Eleanor Vance, when she opened the door, was exactly as Finch remembered, fiercely intelligent, sharp-eyed, and slightly eccentric. She wore thick gardening gloves and an old cable-knit jumper, suggesting she had been engaged in battle with the dense vegetation of her garden. "Alistair, come in. The kettle's just boiled," she said, ushering him into a small, cluttered living room dominated by overflowing bookshelves and a formidable wood-burning stove. The smell of wood smoke and damp wool was pervasive. Finch didn't bother with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase, revealing the encrypted drive, and laid out the printed graphs, the orbital trajectory, the spectral analysis, and the gravitational model demanding the exotic mass parameter. Eleanor poured 2 mugs of tea, strong, builder's brew, no nonsense, and listened in absolute silence. She didn't interrupt, a sign of her deeply ingrained scientific discipline. When Finch finally finished his explanation, detailing the convergence of the 3-eye atlas data with the Sumerian SAR cycle, she took a long, slow sip of her tea. "Bloody hell, Finch," she finally said, using a classic British exclamation that carried the full weight of her professional shock. "You've been sniffing the ether too long." Finch met her gaze, his own eyes tired but resolute. "I know how it sounds, Eleanor. It sounds like the ravings of a man who's lost his nerve. But look at the coherence data, and look at the perturbation model. You know physics. Does this model converge without that artificial mass reduction variable?" Eleanor took the printouts, her sharp gaze scanning the complex equations. She was a master of orbital mechanics, and within 5 minutes her skepticism began to crumble, replaced by a deep professional apprehension. "The maths is clean, Alistair. Almost too clean," she muttered, tapping a point on the graph where the object's trajectory shifted sharply. "If we accept this premise, the artificial damping, then the data supports a planetary body on an extreme elliptical path, a path that brings it close, and the period is clockwork." 3,600 years, Eleanor. "Precisely," Finch confirmed. "The Sumerians weren't writing fiction. They were writing observation logs." The conversation shifted from pure physics to the terrifying implications. Eleanor immediately grasped the political danger. She hadn't been forced out of academia for poor science, but for political inconvenience. She understood the power of the establishment to erase a truth that threatened global stability. If you release this through official channels, they won't just reject the paper. They will revoke your tenure, erase the data, and publicly discredit you until you're nothing more than a footnote in conspiracy theory blogs, Eleanor warned, stoking the fire until the wood crackled loudly. "They have the infrastructure to bury this." Finch nodded. "I know. That's why I came to you. I need your help to disseminate fragments, anonymously, securely, to the global community of amateur astronomers and citizen scientists. They operate outside the funding structure. They are the only ones who can verify the raw data without the fear of losing their positions." Their strategy began to take shape, meticulous and paranoid. They decided to leak the information in a highly distributed, compartmentalized manner. One data package would contain only the refined orbital parameters, the 3,600-year cycle, released through a highly obscure forum dedicated to tracking extreme KBOs. A separate package would contain the raw radio spectral data, the structured bursts, dropped onto a deep web site known for cryptographic puzzles. A third, perhaps most dangerous package would contain the comparative metallurgical analysis of the object's heavy elements, disguised as an anomaly in terrestrial heavy water reactor shielding. "We need plausible deniability, Alistair," Eleanor insisted, her old fire rekindled. "If these pieces are seen together, it's proof. Separate, they are just interesting anomalies that require months of cross-referencing to connect. We need to buy time for the amateurs to confirm the trajectory before the professionals can coordinate the cover-up." The planning session stretched late into the night. Outside, the sounds of the English countryside were muffled and distant. Inside, they were planning cosmic anarchy. Finch detailed the security measures he had already taken: the burner phones, the encrypted tunnels, VPNs nested within VPNs, a truly labyrinthine digital footprint, and the physical distance he had placed between the original data source, Cambridge, and the release point, the remote Cotswold location. Eleanor pointed out a critical vulnerability. The Atlas system itself was highly protected, managed by US and UK military interests. The raw data logs would be scrutinized internally as soon as the object's unusual trajectory became a topic of discussion, even in fringe circles. "We need a distraction," Eleanor mused, stirring her tea. "Something so big, so scientifically noisy, that it covers the initial leak." They settled on a plan involving a deliberately incorrect calculation for a known near-Earth asteroid, NEA, designed to create a momentary panic and redirect surveillance assets towards a false target. A small scientific smokescreen. The operation required high-level coding skills and a deep knowledge of the institutional alert systems, areas where Eleanor, due to her previous work, still retained residual access codes and procedural knowledge. A digital skeleton key she had never fully surrendered. Finch felt a surge of professional admiration for his colleague, mixed with profound guilt for dragging her back into this mess. Eleanor, sensing his unease, simply tapped the screen displaying the 3,600-year orbit. "Don't get sentimental, Alistair. We're fighting against 5 millennia of successful propaganda. If those bastards are coming back, humanity deserves a fighting chance. Even if that chance is only knowledge," she stated, her gaze resolute. "Now let's get these fragments out before the black cars arrive." He glanced out the window, half expecting to see a sleek black Range Rover, the unofficial vehicle of the UK's shadowy surveillance agencies, parked innocuously by Eleanor's stone wall. Nothing. Just the dark, silent fields of the Cotswolds. The silence, however, felt less comforting and more like the heavy calm before a storm. They began the digital work, setting up the release points. Finch was the navigator of the data. Eleanor, the pilot of the dissemination. Each keystroke was a political act, a tiny ripple in the vast ocean of accepted scientific truth. The transition from theory to action was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. He knew deep down that once the first data fragment was released, his quiet, orderly life as Dr. Alistair Finch was irrevocably over. He would become a shadow, hunted by both academic contempt and potentially governmental fear. The initial leak, the highly refined orbital calculation minus the source identification, was dropped onto the Deep Sky Anomaly Forum, a digital watering hole for dedicated amateur astronomers across Europe and America. It was disguised as an anonymous theoretical correction to the Planet 9 hypothesis. The reaction was slow, then sudden. Initially, it was met with the usual online skepticism. A novice error, impossible geometry. But within days, the sheer mathematical elegance of the solution began to attract serious attention. The numbers were too precise to be random noise. Several prominent amateur observatories, one in the Peak District near Sheffield and another run by a retired engineer in Cornwall, began to cross-reference the proposed orbit with publicly available, if distant, observations of 3I Atlas. The results were electrifying. The amateur observations, despite their limited scope, started to confirm the essential feature. The object was indeed moving on an impossible, highly inclined path. When the second fragment, the radio-spectral data, appeared on a dark web cryptography site, disguised as a complex challenge involving alien communication parameters, the global fringe community went into overdrive. Cryptographers, linguists, and engineers who frequented the site immediately recognized the sophistication of the structured bursts. The sheer energy required to generate such a complex, coherent signal across that distance pointed undeniably to artificial origin. The two separate data streams, initially intended to be decoupled, began to merge in the minds of independent researchers. The object with the impossible orbit was also emitting a structured signal. The mainstream media, specifically the UK press, initially ignored the rumblings. The digital chatter was confined to obscure corners of the internet, dismissed as tinfoil hat nonsense. But the scale of the amateur confirmation started to penetrate the lower tiers of journalism. A young, tenacious journalist at The Guardian, specializing in technology and science controversies, picked up the story. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She initially saw it as a human interest piece. Eccentric amateurs challenge Planet 9 consensus. But as she delved deeper, tracking the anonymous sources and the synchronicity of the leaked data points, she realized the story was far more substantial. She discovered the crucial link between the anomalous orbit and the ancient Sumerian star cycle, which had been posted by a history buff on a separate Reddit thread after reading the amateur astronomical commentary. Jenkins began making cautious inquiries, focusing on the origins of the initial data point, the Atlas system. She contacted her sources within the British scientific establishment, seeking confirmation or denial of the orbit model. The response was not a denial, but a chilling silence. Professor Harrington, Finch's departmental head, issued a terse, carefully worded statement to the university media office. Dr. Finch is currently on extended leave for personal reasons. Any speculation regarding his recent research is unsubstantiated and does not reflect the consensus of this institution. The statement was designed to be dismissive, yet its very specificity, naming Finch, was a giveaway. It showed that the establishment was reacting to the internet chatter. Finch and Eleanor, tracking the digital ripple effect from the Cotswolds, realized their fragmentation strategy was working faster than anticipated. The convergence was happening organically, but the increased noise was attracting the attention they had desperately sought to delay. Finch received a series of cryptic, highly professional emails sent to an old, dormant academic account. The emails contained no threats, only carefully phrased advisories about the importance of data integrity and the dangers of public misinformation. They were clearly state-sponsored, designed not to menace, but to signal. One morning, while retrieving milk from the small local shop, Finch noticed the Range Rover. It was parked 2 streets down from his flat, subtly positioned, its windows tinted, undeniably watching. The car was clean, expensive, and carried that unmistakable air of governmental detachment. It wasn't local police, it was professionals. He returned to his flat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt the surveillance net tightening. He and Eleanor needed to move the operation, to go fully dark. The fragmented data had done its job. It was now time to release the final, undeniable proof of the object's mass and its relationship to the forbidden orbit. Finch looked at the framed photograph on his mantelpiece, a picture of his late wife, smiling brightly during a summer holiday in Brighton. He felt a sharp pang of regret. He was sacrificing his safety, his reputation, and his life's work for a truth that most people would refuse to believe, even if it crashed into their back garden. but he remembered the cold, hard certainty of the numbers. The Anunnaki disclosure was happening, propelled by mathematical fate, and he refused to let it happen in secret. He packed a small rucksack, the encrypted drive, a change of clothes, and his battered copy of the Sumerian texts. He left the flat, locking the door behind him, knowing he would likely never return to the comforting mediocrity of his old life. He left behind his tweed jackets and his academic security, choosing the uncertain path of the whistleblower. This is the midpoint of our revelation. The evidence is mounting, and the forces of secrecy are closing in. If the intensity of this chase has kept you glued to the screen, then please support this mission for transparency. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let me know in the comments. The orbit is real. Finch and Eleanor established their new base of operations in a derelict warehouse near the Southampton docks. Eleanor had secured the location through an old, highly illegal contact from her days working on classified satellite imagery, a contact who owed her a considerable favor and asked no questions. The location was perfect, surrounded by the noise and chaos of shipping containers and maritime activity. Their presence was lost in the industrial din. The air here was cold and saline, smelling of diesel and the vast, indifferent ocean. Inside, they had a rudimentary setup, a single halogen lamp casting long shadows, a powerful satellite dish aimed illegally skyward, and two secure laptops operating entirely on independent power sources and filtered through complex mesh networks that made tracking their digital location virtually impossible. Their objective now was to achieve gravitational locking confirmation. They needed to move beyond theoretical convergence and provide hard observational proof of 3I Atlas's massive gravitational influence. This required utilizing high-quality public data from obscure international deep space probes that weren't under immediate UK or US military control. Specifically, they targeted raw data logs from the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, and the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, which maintained excellent, if often overlooked, tracking of distant solar system dynamics. Finch spent days manually filtering gigabytes of telemetry data, searching for minor, consistent deviations in the expected trajectories of distant KBOs that passed near 3I Atlas's projected path. He was looking for the telltale tug, the undeniable proof that a body of substantial planetary mass was present. Eleanor watched him work, her face illuminated by the flickering screen. The atmosphere was one of strained focus. The pressure of time was palpable, not just because of the surveillance, but because the object itself was accelerating. The closer 3I Atlas moved towards the solar system's gravitational well, the easier it would be for the global scientific community to track, and thus the harder it would be for the establishment to maintain the lie of its cometary status. Finch finally shouted, a rare outburst of triumph in the oppressive silence of the warehouse. "I have it, Eleanor. ISRO data, 3 years ago. KBO 2014 MU69. Its perihelion passage showed a deviation of exactly 0.003 arc-seconds from the predicted path. Insignificant on its own, easily dismissed as observational error. He then overlaid the KBO's trajectory with the theoretical path of the massive 3I Atlas object. But look at this," Finch continued, tracing a line on the screen. "That deviation occurs precisely at the point of closest approach to 3I Atlas, and if we calculate the mass required to generate that specific perturbation..." The calculation ran, crunching the numbers with brutal efficiency. The answer flashed. 5.1 Earth masses. 5.1 Earth masses. That was not a comet. That was a small gas giant or a massive, dense super-Earth. It was Planet X. It was Nibiru. Eleanor slowly leaned forward, running her finger over the projected path of the 5 Earth mass body. "Alistair, this is observational proof. This is undeniable. The KBO acts as a cosmic measuring tape. They can dismiss our orbital models, they can dismiss the Sumerian history, but they cannot dismiss the physics of observed gravitational interaction. The gravitational lock confirmed not only the massive scale of the object, but cemented the impossibility of the conventional narrative. The comet was actually a colossal world, moving on a forbidden path. The implications for the Anunnaki theory were profound. A planet of that scale could indeed host a rich, dense atmosphere and stable surface conditions, capable of sustaining a long-lived, technologically advanced civilization over its 3,600-year voyage. The confirmation, however, brought no peace, only a chilling urgency. They now had the smoking gun. They had to release this data immediately. While Finch began preparing the release package, a dense, highly technical paper focused purely on the gravitational analysis of KBO 2014 MU69, Eleanor was monitoring the digital security perimeter. She noticed a subtle, professional attempt to probe their mesh network. It wasn't a brute force attack. It was far more insidious. It was a sophisticated, highly specific packet injection designed to trace the original IP of the ISRO data request. Someone was actively trying to find the source of the KBO deviation analysis. "Alistair, they are here," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight. "The probe is localized. It's coming from a central node, likely GCHQ or its American counterpart. They are reacting to the KBO analysis. They know someone is confirming the mass." Finch paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He looked around the vast, empty warehouse. The only exit led back to the docks. He felt trapped, his fate tied to the trajectory of a returning planet. "We have minutes, maybe hours, before they triangulate this location," Finch stated, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "We push the data now, Eleanor. Full transmission. Send the KBO analysis, the orbital path, and the Sumerian reference key. Everything. Let the world connect the final dots." Eleanor activated the high-gain independent satellite dish, a dangerous, highly detectable broadcast. She bypassed all local ISPs, pushing the massive data file directly into the public domain through multiple redundant channels. A torrent site known for hosting whistleblowers, several high-traffic science news aggregation sites, and most audaciously, a direct, anonymous submission to Sarah Jenkins at The Guardian. The moment the transmission was completed, Eleanor slammed the lid of the laptop shut. "It's out. It's irreversible." Finch grabbed his rucksack. "Time to go, Eleanor. The disclosure is official. Now we run." They slipped out of the warehouse and melted into the chaotic night activity of the Southampton docks, leaving behind only the cold, empty shells of their temporary sanctuary and a digital payload that promised to redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. The release of the KBO gravitational analysis package caused instantaneous and profound shockwaves, far surpassing the initial ripples of the earlier leaks. This was not fringe theory anymore. This was hard, verifiable physics based on independently tracked data. Sarah Jenkins at The Guardian was the first mainstream journalist to act. She published an explosive front-page piece under the screaming headline, "Planetary Mass Anomaly Confirmed. Did Ancient Sumerians Track a Fifth Gas Giant?" The academic world erupted. Initially, the response was furious denial. Professor Harrington, now elevated to the institutional spokesman for the denial, went on BBC Radio 4 to denounce the data as maliciously engineered pseudo-science, suggesting the KBO data had been corrupted by hostile foreign actors attempting to sow confusion in Western scientific consensus. He did not, however, mention Dr. Finch by name, a small mercy that suggested the establishment still wished to control the narrative of his disappearance. But the speed of the global independent verification was overwhelming. Amateur astronomers, utilizing the data provided by Finch and Eleanor, focused their powerful telescopes and computing resources on the relevant KBOs. Within 72 hours, dozens of independent confirmations poured in from observatories across Chile, South Africa, and Australia. The tiny, persistent deviation in KBO 2014 MU69 was real. The mass calculation of 5 Earth masses for 3I Atlas was mathematically sound, provided the extreme orbital parameters were accepted. The narrative shifted from, "Is it real?" to, "What is it?" The established definition of 3I Atlas as a comet became mathematically ludicrous. Comets do not possess the gravitational influence of a small planet. The most terrifying piece of data, the elemental composition, began to receive serious scrutiny. The initial spectroscopy from Jodrell Bank had hinted at high concentrations of heavy, rare elements. Now, with the mass confirmed, scientists were forced to look again at the spectral signature with far greater reverence. The signature was analyzed by a team of independent geochemists in Germany, who initially thought the data represented an error in their equipment. The element showing the highest concentration, besides common silicates, was gold, but not just standard terrestrial gold. It was a specific isotope of gold that suggested formation under unique, non-solar system conditions. Extremely high temperatures and pressures, followed by a unique rapid cooling cycle far from any recognized stellar nursery. The scientific paper produced by the German team, though cautious, used the phrase artificial metallurgical process to describe the object's core composition. Finch's mind raced back to the Sumerian texts, the repeated references to gold and the Anunnaki's desire for it. Sitchin's controversial theory posited that the Anunnaki needed gold, specifically in monatomic form, to repair their atmospheric shielding on Nibiru, which had been degraded by the long, cold voyage through deep space. While Finch didn't fully subscribe to the atmospheric repair hypothesis, he now grasped the chilling convergence, a massive planet-shaped vessel on a 3,600-year orbital schedule, whose core composition was primarily exotic, high-density gold isotopes. This was not a natural occurrence. This was engineering on a planetary scale. The media storm was unparalleled. Cable news channels in the UK and worldwide dedicated round-the-clock coverage, attempting to reconcile modern astronomy with ancient Mesopotamian mythology. The term Anunnaki disclosure entered the popular lexicon, leaping from fringe websites to headline banners. But the response from official government and major scientific bodies was a coordinated wall of silence, punctuated by aggressive denial. Major search engines subtly began adjusting algorithms, pushing scholarly articles, dismissing Sitchin to the top, while burying the independent confirmations of the KBO perturbation deep within the search results. In the UK, the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, DSTL, a government body, issued a terse classified memo to all collaborating universities, mandating the immediate cessation of all research concerning 3I Atlas. The reason given was national security protocols regarding potential debris trajectory analysis. This was a thinly veiled attempt to shut down the observation. Finch, reading this report on a cracked laptop screen in a shabby safe house north of Bristol, felt a cold satisfaction. The official denial was the strongest confirmation he could receive. They were scrambling. He and Eleanor had achieved their initial goal. The truth was out. But now they were faced with the impossible task of surviving the information war they had ignited. The establishment couldn't bury the data, but they could bury the messengers. Every piece of evidence now points to a planetary body that should not exist. If you reach the 70% mark, you are part of the dedicated few willing to face this overwhelming reality. Then, strengthen this content. Like it now, and send this revelation to someone who needs to see it. Despite the intense pressure and the ongoing digital censorship campaign, Finch and Eleanor had one final crucial piece of evidence to solidify their case. the prediction of 3I Atlas's next key orbital event. If the 3600-year Sumerian cycle, SAR, was correct, then the object's trajectory should align perfectly with specific past events known for their civilizational upheaval and cataclysmic geological activity, events often attributed in mythology to the direct interference of gods. Finch, using the fully confirmed 5.1 Earth mass model, calculated the exact previous passages. The results were stunningly precise. Circa 1600 BCE corresponds directly with the collapse of the Minoan civilization, Thera eruption, and widespread societal turmoil across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Circa 5200 BCE aligns with the end of the Neolithic period and the rapid, unexplained emergence of complex, centralized societies in Mesopotamia, the beginning of Sumer. Circa 8800 BCE corresponds with a global rapid temperature shift and sea level rise often linked to the myth of the Great Flood, a catastrophe explicitly detailed in the Sumerian tablets as a result of the gods' actions. The planet's passage wasn't random. It was intrinsically tied to the dramatic historical turning points of Earth. This provided the final philosophical layer to the disclosure. 3I Atlas wasn't just passing by, its orbital rhythm defined human history. Eleanor, who had initially maintained a purely scientific distance from the mythological aspects, stared at the data. They don't just visit Alistair, they manage us. They timed their return to moments of global vulnerability or critical development. "It's the ultimate timekeeper, Eleanor," Finch replied, his voice soft with reverence and fear. "They seed, they watch, and they return to harvest or correct. And they are due back now, cosmically speaking, within the next few decades." The intelligence agencies, now fully activated, were not interested in the scientific truth. They were interested in suppressing the panic. Their primary goal shifted from finding Finch to neutralizing the information stream. Eleanor noticed a coordinated effort by major satellite providers, many with deep ties to UK-US military contractors, to temporarily recalibrate their deep space antennae, disrupting the ability of global amateur networks to independently track 3I Atlas. It was a digital blackout, imposed under the guise of technical upgrades. Finch and Eleanor had anticipated this. Their final data payload included a highly detailed map of secondary, less-used radio frequencies and obscure communication relays, allowing the global network of citizen scientists to bypass the official censorship. They were fighting the information war not with force, but with decentralized cleverness. The strain was immense. Finch was living on adrenaline and the knowledge that he had fundamentally changed the world, but the cost was steep. He hadn't seen his sister or spoken to any former friends. His reputation was, officially, ashes. He was a fugitive, reliant on Eleanor's dwindling network of disreputable contacts for safe passage across the UK. One evening, while hiding in a tiny, cold B&B room in the Welsh Valleys, Finch watched a state-funded documentary on the BBC. It featured Professor Harrington calmly explaining that the current Nibiru hysteria was a symptom of global anxiety and exploited flaws in ancient translations. Harrington looked directly into the camera, radiating confidence and manufactured authority. "The greatest danger to society," Harrington asserted, "is not fictional planets, but the reckless abandonment of scientific methodology in favor of sensationalist mythology. We must trust the data, the full data, and reject the emotional pull of crackpot theories." Finch felt a surge of cold fury. Harrington was not arguing against the data. He was arguing against the fear the data induced, thereby protecting the established order. The real crime was not the lie, but the control of belief. "He's good," Eleanor commented, watching the broadcast with a cynical smirk. "He's selling comfort, and people will buy it, Alistair. People always prefer a comforting lie to a challenging truth." Finch knew that their next, final move had to be tactical. They needed to force a reaction, to compel the official bodies to acknowledge the object's existence, thus validating the entire disclosure. They couldn't rely on scientific journals or the mainstream press. They needed a shockwave. They began planning the transmission of a powerful coded message, using the structured radio signature they had discovered, aimed not at the Anunnaki, but directly at the receiving arrays of the world's most powerful nations. A digital declaration of war against the lie. We are nearing the final revelation, where the truth becomes a weapon. If you are still with us, you understand the magnitude of this forbidden orbit. Then strengthen this content, like it now, and send this revelation to someone who needs to see it. The focus now shifted entirely from if 3i Atlas was real to what 3i Atlas meant for humanity upon its return. Finch, drawing upon the Sumerian texts, knew this wasn't merely a passive flyby. The Anunnaki were described as demanding, hierarchical, and capable of both immense creation, terraforming, engineering human life, and immense destruction, the flood. He reasoned that the 3,600-year cycle was a form of cosmic management. The Anunnaki, operating on a timescale far beyond human comprehension, viewed Earth as a resource bank and humanity as a workforce, genetically engineered for the purpose of gold mining or perhaps some other more esoteric labor. The concept was existentially terrifying. Humanity was not the apex of evolution. It was a carefully curated experiment, a project set aside for cyclical review. Finch studied the cuneiform accounts of the Anunnaki hierarchy, specifically the figures of Enki and Enlil, the rival gods. Enki, often depicted as the benevolent creator of human beings through genetic manipulation, and Enlil, the stern disciplinarian who allegedly desired humanity's destruction during the flood. If the planet was returning, which faction would be in charge? And what was the state of the human project? Had Earth produced enough gold? Had humanity evolved in a way that pleased or displeased its creators? The fear was that the Anunnaki would return, not as saviors, but as meticulous auditors, ready to scrap a failed experiment. Finch and Eleanor moved to a temporary, secure base in a rented, isolated flat above a shuttered restaurant in Glasgow, far north, utilizing the vast, quiet spectrum of the Northern Hemisphere for their transmission. The cold, urban decay of the city felt appropriate for their desperate task. They had built a robust, secure transmission system utilizing decommissioned marine radio equipment. Their plan was simple: broadcast a message utilizing the same complex, structured frequency, the Anunnaki signal they had detected from 3i Atlas, but superimposed with a modern human digital signature, a complex mathematical pattern based on prime numbers, proving that humanity was aware, intelligent, and tracking the object. "It's a digital handshake, Alistair," Eleanor explained, calibrating the massive antenna they had disguised as a ventilation unit on the flat's roof. "We are signaling our awareness of their presence and their orbit. We are saying, we know who you are, and we know you are coming." The purpose of the broadcast was twofold. One, to force a response from the 3i Atlas object itself, providing further confirmation of intelligent operation. Two, to trigger an immediate massive response from the governmental agencies, MI6, GCHQ, NSA, tracking this specific exotic frequency, thereby forcing them to publicly acknowledge the object's artificial nature when they attempt to trace and intercept the human signal. It was a brilliant trap. To capture the broadcast, the agencies would have to admit the frequency was real, structured, and under surveillance, validating Finch's initial spectral findings. The moment of transmission was fraught with tension. The marine radio equipment crackled to life, drawing immense power from the flat's outdated electrical system, causing the lights to flicker violently. Finch initiated the sequence. The digital signature, a complex array of 64-bit encryption keys overlaid onto the prime number pattern, was ready. The power surged. Beep, beep, beep. The structured signal, a defiant, invisible beacon of human consciousness, shot out into the cold Scottish night, aimed precisely at the currently estimated location of 3I Atlas, hundreds of millions of miles away. The feeling was electric. Finch felt an impossible sense of connection to the great, silent ship of the cosmos. He was talking to history. He was calling out to his creators. Eleanor monitored the network activity. Within 5 minutes, the immediate, panicked reaction began. Digital intercept protocols, clearly automated and high-level, flooded the periphery of their mesh network. The agencies were scrambling, trying to trace the source of the terrestrial broadcast on the forbidden frequency. "It's working, Alistair. They are trying to locate us. GCHQ assets are now fully engaged in filtering the prime number pattern. They know this is an intentional human communication," Eleanor yelled over the hum of the equipment. But the real fear was the response from the heavens. Did 3I Atlas, hundreds of millions of miles away, detect the human signal? Would it reply? They waited, breath held, for 30 agonizing minutes. The local surveillance activity peaked. Finch heard the faint, distant whine of a police siren, perhaps local, perhaps military, but closing fast. Then Eleanor looked up, her face pale. "Alistair, I'm receiving an echo. Faint, but definitely an echo of our own prime number sequence, slightly altered, returning on the same frequency. The latency is correct for the distance." The silence in the flat was absolute. The message had been received, and, chillingly, it had been acknowledged. Finch and Eleanor bolted. They knew the echo, the acknowledgement, was the final, undeniable proof of intelligent life aboard 3I Atlas. And that proof was now in the hands of global intelligence agencies forcing their hand. The police siren outside grew louder. They scrambled down the fire escape of the Glasgow flat, leaving the sophisticated marine radio system behind as a sacrifice. They had confirmed the truth, but they had sacrificed their last secure location. The official response was instant and brutal. Within hours, the government issued a national security alert regarding unauthorized high-power radio transmissions causing interference with military communications. The focus was purely technical, ignoring the content, but the effect was a blanket media ban on any discussion of the forbidden frequency. The public, already reeling from the orbital confirmation, was now confronted with a coordinated governmental panic. The narrative became fractured. Was this genuine alien contact, or was it a complex, hostile nation-state using sophisticated technology to destabilize Western scientific credibility? Professor Harrington, again appearing on television, claimed the entire sequence was a calculated foreign hoax designed to exploit existing societal anxieties. Finch and Eleanor found refuge in a cramped bedsit in Newcastle, living off pre-packaged supermarket meals and the dwindling cash reserves Eleanor had squirreled away years ago. The world outside, the world they had tried to enlighten, was descending into chaos. Amateur astronomers who had confirmed the KBO data suddenly found their data repositories wiped, their social media accounts suspended, and their professional reputations attacked by legions of online bots claiming they were disseminating fake news generated by AI. The digital infrastructure of the global scientific community was being weaponized against its own truth seekers. Finch observed the psychological effect. The rapid shift from rational discussion to panicked tribalism. When faced with a truth that demolishes their worldview, most people choose the comfort of the familiar lie, especially when endorsed by authority figures like Harrington. Eleanor, watching a segment about the censorship on a protected deep web channel, looked utterly drained. They're not just fighting the science, Alistair. They're fighting the philosophy. They can't allow humanity to believe we are managed livestock. It ruins the entire capitalist religious paradigm. The ethical debate inside Finch raged. Had he done the right thing by initiating panic, or should he have maintained silence, allowing the governing bodies time to formulate a coordinated, perhaps less chaotic response? He realized, however, that silence would have meant capitulation. The government's immediate priority was control, not disclosure. They were preparing for the return of the Anunnaki, not by preparing humanity, but by preparing an internal defense. A strategy bound to fail against an intergalactic civilization. Finch knew he had to deliver one last, unassailable piece of evidence. The full, unredacted history of the Anunnaki's cyclical intervention, stripped bare of Sitchin sensationalism and grounded in archaeological fact, combined with the final orbital model. This final document had to be the definitive historical scientific synthesis. He sat down to write. The document was titled The Cycle of Destiny, a synthesis of 3-eye Atlas trajectory and Sumerian historical records. He detailed the geological evidence that coincided with the 3,600-year cycle. Evidence of rapid magnetic pole shifts, massive volcanic activity spikes, and sudden globally synchronized climate changes that suggested colossal external gravitational influence during the planet's perihelion passage. He argued meticulously that the object 3-eye Atlas was not merely a threat, but a highly sophisticated mobile habitat that had been orbiting the Sun for at least 450,000 years, coinciding precisely with the Sumerian creation myths. The disclosure was not about the future. It was about reclaiming our true, forgotten past. He worked for 2 solid weeks, surviving on minimal sleep and fierce dedication. Eleanor, meanwhile, established a complex, timed dead man's switch, a digital mechanism designed to release the final document automatically if they failed to log into a specific server address within a 72-hour window. The plan was clear. They would attempt one last, high-risk physical meeting with Sarah Jenkins, the journalist, providing her with the unencrypted final document as insurance. If they were caught, the data would automatically release anyway. The truth would survive them. London was their most dangerous target. Its density, its ubiquitous CCTV network, and the high concentration of intelligence assets made it a terrifying environment for fugitives. Yet it was the only place they could guarantee meeting Sarah Jenkins, who was now operating under intense scrutiny herself. They chose King's Cross Station, relying on the sheer volume of people, the rush of commuters, tourists and students, to mask their presence. Finch and Eleanor dressed mundanely, trying to blend into the sea of grey British travellers. Finch in a simple dark jumper and trousers. Eleanor in a thick coat, carrying a seemingly oversized rucksack. The physical key to the final data, a titanium memory card, was sewn into the lining of Finch's jumper. They located Sarah Jenkins, who was sitting nervously in a coffee shop within the station, pretending to read a newspaper while monitoring her surroundings. She was thin, her eyes darting constantly. The pressure of being a central figure in the Anunnaki disclosure had clearly taken its toll. Finch approached the table, keeping his voice low, the noise of the station a perfect acoustic shield. "Sarah, it's Alistair Finch," he murmured, sliding into the seat opposite her. Jenkins looked up, her relief mixed with immediate panic. "Dr. Finch, you shouldn't be here. They're everywhere. I know I'm being tracked." "We know," Eleanor said, sitting slightly apart, maintaining visual surveillance of the station entrance. "We need to give you the final analysis, the full picture. It proves the orbital cycle against the geological record. It's the fail-safe." Finch reached into his jumper, carefully working at the thread, holding the memory card in place. It was in that precise moment that the noise of the station seemed to cut out entirely for Finch. He caught Eleanor's eye, and she gave a minute, panicked shake of her head. They were compromised. 2 men in remarkably well-tailored dark suits, carrying the unmistakable air of governmental authority, moved swiftly and silently toward their table. They didn't shout, they didn't draw weapons, they simply moved with professional certainty. "Dr. Finch, Dr. Vance, we need you to come with us, quietly," one of them stated, his voice calm yet utterly non-negotiable, speaking with the clipped, educated accent of a senior civil servant. Finch felt the immediate, chilling realization of defeat. They were caught. His only priority was the data. He yanked the memory card free and, in one rapid movement, tossed it across the table toward Jenkins, who instinctively caught it, concealing it within the newspaper she was holding. "Read the file." "Release it all, Sarah," Finch whispered fiercely. The man in the suit grabbed Finch's arm, the grip surprisingly strong. Eleanor, ever defiant, shouted a warning that was lost in the crowd. "The public deserves the truth," she cried, attracting the attention of several onlookers who immediately pulled out their mobile phones, capturing the scene. The agents were professionals. They showed Finch and Eleanor badges, identifying themselves as national security liaisons, and quickly bundled them away from the immediate chaos toward a service lift, the kind used for staff, leading directly to a secure exit. Jenkins, frozen for a second, felt the weight of the memory card in her hand. She watched Finch and Eleanor, the last two beacons of scientific integrity, disappear into the anonymity of the government system. She was now the sole possessor of the Anunnaki disclosure. Finch and Eleanor were transported to a secure, windowless facility, not a prison, but a governmental holding facility in a nondescript location somewhere south of London. The interrogation was not brutal, but psychological. They were not beaten. They were reasoned with. The interrogator, a woman who introduced herself only as Agent K, was highly intelligent and calm. "Dr. Finch, we understand your concerns, but the release of this information causes irreparable damage to social order. The return of Three-Eye Atlas, or Nibiru as you call it, is an event that requires coordinated state-level preparation, not civilian panic," Agent K explained, sitting across a steel table. "Preparation for what, Agent K?" Finch challenged, his voice raspy. "For war? Against a civilization that can weaponize orbital mechanics, or preparation for silence, maintaining the lie until the last possible moment?" Agent K did not flinch. "We are preparing for a dialogue, Dr. Finch. But that dialogue must be on our terms, not yours. Your actions have forced our hand." Finch's greatest fear was confirmed. The UK government had known, or at least suspected, the object's identity for some time, likely based on highly classified deep space monitoring, and had actively suppressed the information to maintain global control. His only solace was the memory card in Sarah Jenkins' hand and the knowledge of the dead man's switch. Even in captivity, his truth would find its way out. The confinement was defined by total sensory deprivation. Finch was held in a stark white room, allowed only basic rations and heavily filtered news feeds. The world outside had moved on, oscillating between acceptance and denial of the Anunnaki disclosure. In the solitude, Finch focused on the mathematical and historical finality of the 3,600-year cycle. He reconstructed the narrative of the Anunnaki's previous visits in his mind, trying to predict their objective for this return. The Sumerian tablets spoke of the Anunnaki's immense lifespan, equating one Sar, 3,600 years, to perhaps one terrestrial year for them. To them, the long voyage was merely a cyclical commute. The question was what they expected to find upon their arrival this time. Finch theorized that the technological level of the human species was their primary metric. In previous cycles, humans were primitive, needing guidance and genetic upgrades. Now, humanity was fractured, technologically advanced, but spiritually and politically volatile, a dangerous mix. He detailed in his internal monologue, which he meticulously recorded in his mind should he ever escape, the exact date of Nibiru's projected perihelion, the moment of closest approach. Based on the convergence of the KBO data and the Sumerian chronology, The planet was due to swing through the inner system around the year 2040. That date, less than 2 decades away, gave the global powers a terrifyingly narrow window to prepare for contact. Sarah Jenkins, meanwhile, was in a desperate race against time. The pressure on the Guardian was immense. Governmental lawyers were threatening injunctions based on the interference with national security caused by the radio transmission leak. She had the memory card, the ultimate evidence. But releasing it too soon, without proper contextualization, could lead to its immediate dismissal amidst the ongoing manufactured chaos. She needed a moment of undeniable clarity. She decided to trigger the dead man's switch. She deliberately failed to log into Finch's pre-designated server, ensuring that the final authenticated document, the Cycle of Destiny, would be released automatically and globally. The digital trigger was tripped. A complex, self-replicating file burst onto the internet, appearing simultaneously across hundreds of independent servers worldwide. It contained the KBO analysis, the 3600-year cycle, the geological alignment proof, and, crucially, Finch's synthesis linking 3I Atlas to the Anunnaki and the dates of past interventions. This was the full, unvarnished disclosure. The release was an intellectual detonation. For the first time, all the disparate pieces of the conspiracy, the object, the orbit, the mass, the history, and the alien nature were unified in a single scholarly document backed by a scientist who had just disappeared. The effect was not immediate panic, but a profound global contemplation. People began cross-referencing the dates: 1600 BCE, 5200 BCE, the flood. The history books suddenly felt incomplete. The official narrative was shattered not by speculation, but by the relentless logic of mathematics and archaeology. Governments, including the UK, were left with no option but to respond. The Prime Minister held a televised address, cautiously admitting that an unusually massive extrasolar object was being tracked, but reiterating that there was no immediate threat and condemning the reckless dissemination of ancient, unproven myths. The lie was partially retracted, replaced by a half-truth. Finch, sitting in his sterile white room, watched the address on a small, grainy television. The Prime Minister's words were carefully chosen, designed to calm, not inform. But the admission, the word massive, was victory enough. The object was real. The forbidden orbit was confirmed. His memory card had done its job. The world was forced to confront the impossible truth that a civilization far older and far more advanced than ours was currently sailing back towards Earth, following an established schedule. Finch smiled faintly in the isolation of his room. He had lost his freedom, but he had won the war for awareness. Humanity was looking up, and for the first time in millennia, it was looking up with knowledge, not just wonder. If this content has truly opened your mind to the forbidden orbit, comment below, "I made it to the end." This helps us understand who is genuinely seeking knowledge beyond the surface. Like the video, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because the next episodes will go even deeper into the implications of the Anunnaki's return. And don't leave without clicking the next video. It is the continuation of this vital journey. Dr. Alistair Finch and Dr. Eleanor Vance remain officially listed as missing persons by their respective universities, with an underlying unspoken governmental assumption that they are in protective custody. Their current location is unknown, their voices silenced. However, their legacy, the Anunnaki disclosure, continues to grow. Independent scientific groups, now operating with the full knowledge of the 3600-year orbit and the KBO evidence, have formed alliances. They are pooling global resources, bypassing the official censorship and focusing on one primary task: monitoring 3I Atlas. The object is still hundreds of millions of miles away, moving steadily closer, gathering speed. Its structured radio emissions are now being detected by sensitive amateur arrays across the globe, providing real-time data that confirms the return of an intelligent, powerful civilization. The world is forced into a state of suspended anticipation. Governments are covertly accelerating military space programs, attempting to develop technologies that might be able to intercept or, at the very least, communicate with the approaching vessel. They are no longer denying the orbit. They are planning for the contact. The final image, as depicted in Finch's Cycle of Destiny synthesis, is a vast, elegant diagram of the solar system. The planets follow their familiar paths, circling the sun like predictable satellites. And then, from the lower left, comes the majestic, sweeping trajectory of 3i Atlas. It moves with the confidence of an object that has performed this routine countless times. It is Nibiru, the planet of the crossing, returning to claim its place in the solar hierarchy, and to observe the results of its last intervention 3,600 years ago. The ultimate question remains unanswered. What are the Anunnaki's intentions? Are they returning as gods, demanding worship and resources? Or are they returning as creators, disappointed by the chaotic, self-destructive path of their human experiment? The knowledge unleashed by Dr. Alistair Finch did not provide comfort. It provided clarity, a clarity that humanity desperately needed before its cosmic rendezvous. The rain continues to fall over England, washing the streets of Oxford and the vast dish of Jodrell Bank. The Range Rovers are still present, watching, waiting, but now millions of people worldwide are also watching the sky, no longer for a simple comet, but for a world that holds the key to our origin and our future. The forbidden orbit is no longer a myth. It is destiny, approaching rapidly. The screen fades to black, leaving the viewer with the chilling sound of the structured radio signal, the faint, rhythmic beep, beep, echoing across the vast, indifferent cosmos.